Well, it is right at noon, Howard. If you're ready to go, I'll go ahead and do intros.
All right.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us on our Raising Your Dairy Best Heifer webinar series. This is season 2 of the webinar series, bringing back some new topics to the series here. And we're kind of wrapping up our series here. We got a couple more weeks yet of the season, but if you missed some of them, you can go back into our YouTube channel and view them online. We had a lot of great topics so far this year. So if you haven't had a chance to review them, I'll put the link into the chat here today so you can go back and view them. This one is also going to be recorded, and so you'll be able to go back and view this as well. My name is Jennifer Bentley. I work as a dairy field specialist housed in Northeast Iowa, and I have my colleagues here on Fred Hall in Northwest Iowa and Larry Tranel based out of Northeast and Southeast Iowa. And so if there's any questions that come up in the chat, they're going to help facilitate those questions there at the end. So go ahead as we go through the presentation, put those into the chat and we'll address those along the way or at the end. I will have an evaluation at the end. So if people are logging on, if you wouldn't mind clicking on that link towards the end of the presentation, that helps us with our webinar series evaluation as well. So to get started, Howard, if you want to advance to the next slide here. We are going to be talking about fresh cow success starts with the heifer calving pen readiness. Our presenter here today is Dr. Howard Tyler, Iowa State University. He started with Iowa State University in the dairy science program with a variety of teaching, research, and extension opportunities. He taught the senior dairy management course for over 25 years, in addition to other courses, but his research program was focused heavily on the adaptation of the newborn during the first day of life. And he's been in lots of other projects with nutrition and management of pre-weaned calves. If you follow any of the calf research projects, you know that he's a chapter author in the Raising Dairy Replacements, the calf development and birth chapter. And he's also a co-author of the Dairy Cattle Science Handbook. So we're pleased to have him on here as well. And he did just recently retire, but we brought him back out of retirement to give us one last maybe not last presentation. Maybe we'll get you on again, right, Howard? But appreciate you being on here today. And with that, I'll let you take it over.
Some thanks, Jen. Um, as Jen said, I was asked today to talk about uh, managing heifers through the calving pen, and it's a fun topic to talk about because it's actually an area of management that people can make a big difference in profitability by focusing on. So I always enjoy talking about things that people can take home and use, and I think this is one of those topics. So I always start with why should you care? And why should you care? To me, focuses around can I make more money at this if I do it well? Um, and there are the costs around transition cows in the dairy industry are huge. Um, the good part about it is through focused management, we can reduce some of those losses that happen due to transition cow issues. Another thing to focus on for this talk is that in the average dairy herd, about 30% of the animals working through the calving pen per year are heifers, and they carry a much higher percentage of the issues associated with transition animals. So they also carry a much higher load of the transition losses. So the losses associated, the financial losses associated with heifers in the transition period are well over half of the losses associated through the whole herd. So really focusing on heifers will also help cows and reduce the losses that come through this time. So dystocia is a big source of that loss, and part of the issue that happens with dystocia is the losses that occur with stillbirths. And you can see here that the more we assist, the more stillbirths that we have. It's a pretty linear effect up into extreme force. So anytime that we put a calf jack on an animal, we have about a 50-50 chance of having a stillborn animal out of that delivery. This is data from over 700,000 animals over 15 years. So it's pretty good industry-wide data. It can vary from herd to herd, but industry-wide, this is what we're looking at. And you can see that heifers are not an exception to this, but actually have slightly higher losses. associated with that. Calf mortality after birth is also associated with dystocia and colostrum, which is happening in the maternity pen. So focusing at that time can really reduce calf losses all the way up through weaning. Industry-wide, we do a pretty poor job at reducing these losses. So our stillbirth rate nationally runs about 9%. For herds that really focus on this, they can get this down to less than 1%. But I've also worked with herds that had stillbirth rates, so calves born dead at birth, that were over 25%. Overall mortality rates can range from 1 to 70% on farms. And that can be the 70% can be a really scary number, but the 1% should give everyone hope that if you really focus on this, you can really reduce the animal losses and the financial losses associated with this. Dystocia also has long-term impacts. So managing heifers well through the calving period, you can see that the milk production losses associated with different calving ease scores are pretty high. And again, when you get up to where you put a jack on animals that calving ease score of 5, the losses with heifers are the greatest by far. So we're losing over 1,500 pounds per animal for every time that we put the jack on there. So that should motivate us pretty hard to try and reduce dystocia incidence. And again, it's not that hard to make a difference here. Also increases reproductive losses. So again, with calving ease 5, that's about a 30-day increase in days open for heifers and for cows. So it's a pretty big motivation again to try and reduce those times when we need to assess, because every time we put hands on a cow, we're losing milk, decreasing reproductive performance, and increasing the risk of that calf dying. So we should try and have as many unassisted births as possible, but that takes patience and training. So the rest of this talk is really kind of focused on why are heifers such a problem in herds, and why are they so challenging compared to cows? And there's a few key points that I want people to take home from this. So I'll try and emphasize that as we go through the talk. So understanding heifer behavior around this period is important. This part is a really key point. Heifers tend to be socially submissive. So in general, when you put heifers in with cows, they will be the submissive animals in the pen, and they will take the brunt of the aggressive behavior. They also, because of this, and partly because of this at least, prefer to isolate more than cows when they're calving, and they're more likely to isolate farther away from the group if they have the opportunity. Heifers tend to be more restless during labor, even during stage 1 labor. So they start stage 1 labor earlier, or it takes them longer to get through it, really, partly because they're restless, partly because they're easily interrupted because they're socially submissive. Stage 2 labor, so active labor, takes longer. Again, because anything can disrupt them because it's a novel experience and they're socially submissive. So they lie down less than cows during the weeks before and after calving. This is an indication of stress, and reduced lying time results in less milk production in these animals too. So trying to reduce the stress associated with that whole period, several weeks before and a few weeks after calving, is crucially important for getting heifers to produce well. And because heifers are such a high percentage of the herd, this is really important for profitability. Heifers tend to eat less on a body weight basis than cows in the last few weeks before calving and the first few weeks after calving. Partly, again, is because they're submissive. They're more easily knocked off the feed bunk by older animals. They tend to avoid feed bunks when the feed bunk is crowded, so they'll wait their turn and therefore get less feed. And they also take longer to adjust to fresh cow rations post-calving. And partly that's a new feed issue. All all mammals actually show this behavior. If if as adults, if you're exposed to feeds or foods that you haven't been exposed to earlier in life, they tend to avoid them. So for heifers, it's important to introduce the ration ingredients that will be in the fresh cow ration into the heifer ration so that they will stay on feed better post calving, especially if they're feeds with stronger flavors like rye or barley, or stronger taste or textures like cottonseed meal, or whole cottonseed. They need to be exposed to those before their first exposure should not be in a fresh cow ration because they will just eat less, and try and avoid that. Other stress sources, um, again, a big one is novelty for them. So the typical heifer is moved into 3 to 5 new pens in a period of less than a month around calving. And these are pens that they've never been to. For older cows, this isn't their first rodeo. It's not nearly as stressful. For heifers, this is extraordinarily stressful moving into each one of these pens. So if we can mitigate that stress, and there are strategies that we can use to try and mitigate the stress and reduce this and make this less of a challenge. So part of that is timing. Turns out cows are more aggressive in the morning, um, immediately post milking, right as they're going out to get to the feed bunk. They tend to be more aggressive at that point. So heifers that are moved in the morning into either close-up pens or post-calving pens, fresh cow pens, tend to experience more aggression from older cows than those that are moved in the evening. So if you can just try and shift most of the movement to the evenings, that reduces some of the stress associated with that move. Moving heifers with a herd mate greatly reduces the stress associated with pen changes. And sometimes this is possible and sometimes not, but when possible, try and move heifers together, either in pairs or in larger groups, and to maintain a little bit of social structure. Um, there's a lot of research that shows that those companion animals that are moved together will spend more time close together and actually spend more time lying down and resting than if they're moved individually. Commingling heifers with older cows prepartum lets them adjust to that social stress more than if we wait and their first experience is into the lactating pen. So we either want to keep socially stable groups throughout that whole process or commingle heifers early with companion animals so that they can adjust to being around older cows. If we try and move social groups together, which is an ideal situation, it requires increasing pen sizes pretty dramatically. So it's a great strategy to reduce stress. It's a tough strategy to implement on a lot of farms because of the size of pens that are needed to move groups of heifers together at the same time. So calving time is another really challenging time for managing heifers through this period. And typically, well, most of the typical recommendations out there say move late gestation heifers or cows from pre-fresh into maternity areas somewhere 24 to 48 hours prior to calving. But really the timing of that depends on the temperament of the animal. So again, heifers that haven't been around older cows need more time to adapt if they're going into a group maternity pen. And the capacity of the pen is really important. So if we're trying to move a social group, that reduces stress for the animals, but we're also trying to minimize animal density in the maternity pen as much as possible. And so those two goals are in conflict with each other. So we're always trying to balance between what is best for our pen size and what is best for the individual animal that we're moving. It's also really challenging to predict timing to calving with a great degree of accuracy when you're more than a day out from calving. So a lot of that is judgment and really understanding the stages of calving and what's happening with the cow, um, and how she looks through that period, and trying to be as accurate as possible. Those movements need to be stress-free between pens. So having a maternity pen that's close to the pre-fresh pen, um, good lighting, good footing, moving heifer slowly and calming, with a companion animal as possible. I rarely see animals moved in this way on a lot of the farms that I've been on. A lot of the times they're moving cows, even in just-in-time situations, they're moving calving cows in the same way that they'd move lactating cows into a holding pen. And there's a lot of noise. I've seen cows with calves hanging out of them run down a long alley into another pen. And if you run a heifer that's in the middle of calving down an alley with poor footing into a pen that she's never been into, without a companion animal available, you will knock her out of the calving process for at least a half a day typically. For heifers, it can take, on average, it's between 10 and 15 hours that it takes them to adjust to a stressful move like that. Cows will come back into labor within 30 minutes to an hour and a half, but heifers, this is a much more stressful process. I think for all animals, it's good practice to try and move them calmly, and slowly, especially when they're close to or in the process of calving, but especially so with heifers. So yeah, moving heifers too close to calving interrupts the normal progression of labor. Research shows 2.5-fold increase in stillbirths if we're moving them during either late stage 1 or stage 2 labor. So even if the calf hasn't started to present itself, moving heifers at this stage is really challenging. It doesn't have to lead to this high stillbirth rate, but in general, it does. So we can reduce that again by having companion animals going with them and moving them slowly and calmly, and trying to have them have pre-experience with pens before their first experiences during calving. So in general, I would say it's good practice to try and avoid the just-in-time movement strategies for heifers, and try not to move them when they're in labor, because it works out really poorly for them. So trying to optimize that calving environment is really important. Pastures oftentimes are discussed as being an ideal calving environment, which they can be. It's challenging because, again, that isolation practice, especially with heifers trying to isolate themselves in a pasture, you have to make sure that your worst pasture situation is an acceptable calving situation, because heifers will tend to find that worst possible area to isolate themselves or back themselves into a corner, and deliver that calf under a fence to where the calf is on one side of the fence and they're on the other. They just find bad places sometimes. It also, especially if you've got larger groups, increases risk of identification errors. And again, research says 10 to 15% of all registered animals have been wrongly identified. This is by DNA analysis. And this is typical for group pens or pasture calving, is the ability to correctly identify that calf with the appropriate dam is really challenging, and we miss it a lot. So for registered animals, obviously that's a big issue, but even for commercial herds, when you're going to make breeding decision, if you've misidentified 15-20% of your animals, and and you're trying to make appropriate breeding decisions and avoid inbreeding, it's hard when you don't know who that animal really is. Facility design and layout is really important in maternity areas. So especially if we're just designing a facility, we can do this really well or really poorly. So keep in mind that heifer calving time and the newborn calf are the most highly immunocompromised animals on the facility. So we'd like to keep them away from pathogens as much as possible. So again, clean, dry, well ventilated. We preach that about all animals, but especially in the maternity area. Um, you want it to be as dry as possible, as well bedded as possible, as well ventilated as possible. We want to make sure that air movement is going and moving air away from your maternity areas, and not moving air into the maternity areas from other areas. So I've seen a lot of operations where they combine hospital and maternity areas. Super challenging to make sure that pathogen flow isn't moving towards the maternity area, um, and that you're not just infecting animals, both cows and calves at the time of birth. Different maternity pen options, individual calving versus group pens. So there's pros and cons for both. The pros for individual calving is we can monitor cows more closely on an individual basis. We can monitor their feed intake individually, which you can't do in a group situation. You can minimize biosecurity issues because you only have that calf being exposed to their dams pathogens at that time. Eliminates identification issues. If you do have to assist, it's safer for the cow and for the workers that are trying to assist. And it's a safer environment for the calf after birth. The cons, it's by far the most costly and most labor-intensive method of calving out cows. And unless you have multiple cows in individual pens next to each other, isolation can be really stressful for herd animals. And again, especially heifers, moving them into a new environment by themselves. Need quite a bit of space, ideally 200 square feet of space in a maternity pen, and to an individual calving pen at that point. So group pens are more commonly used on a lot of the farms that I've been on. And the pros for those is they save labor and they save money. They don't isolate animals from other animals in the group. And the presence of cows that are calving will stimulate other cows in that group pen to start calving. So that can be a pro as well. The cons for group pens, in many cases, and this one can be mitigated, but in many cases, there's ever-changing social dynamics, especially if you're doing just-in-time calving movement. You're constantly moving new animals in and out of the group, and that disrupts cows that are in the middle of calving. The biosecurity is much more of a challenge. It's hard to limit the transfer of fecal oral pathogens between cows and calves when you have a group of cows together. Herd animals like to isolate, and it can be challenging in a lot of group pens. And then also especially dominant cows can get really maternally aggressive, and they'll try and steal calves that aren't theirs. This can be really dangerous to the calf that's being born or is newly born. Over the years, I've seen a lot of calves get broken legs, broken ribs, get really severely injured by other cows that are trying to fight over and steal and adopt that calf away from their mother. The other issue, again, is less individual attention, especially if assistance is needed. And when it is needed, it's more challenging to assist safely for the workers because those maternally aggressive cows can not just be hard on calves, but they can also attack the person who's trying to assist the cow that's calving. Stocking density needs to be appropriate and feed and water need to be accessible. So you can think about your own operation and look, does it look more like the picture at the top or the picture at the bottom? And the picture at the bottom would be very minimal spacing that you would want. That's about 20 square meters per cow. And our minimum that we would want is 16. And ideally, we'd want double that. So ideally, we'd want over 100 to 120 square feet per cow, which is about twice the spacing of what you see in that bottom picture. If you think about that. So it'd be like just having two cows in that pen. And there's not many operations that I walk on that achieve that density. But to have minimal disruption during calving, that should be our goal. What we can do to try and mitigate some of that is to create blinds in group calving pens. Um, and a blind is simply a space where cows can isolate within a group environment. So they create opportunities for animals to move further away. We try and put it as far away from feed and water as possible because that's where cows are going to be congregating and moving and more disruptive. So it allows cows and especially heifers to go and find a corner to isolate where they can have some type of physical barrier and sometimes even visual isolation to go there. So in the picture at the top there that they had shade screens that were used that you can't see that are at the sides and the back of the blinds in the back there. And that's what they had at the front was used fire hose that they were using for this. And on one side, it's 50% visual blindness, and on the second side, it's 100% visual isolation. Cows will really use these at night more heavily than during the, well, sorry, they will use the blinds during the daytime more than at night. At night, it's about 50-50 whether cows will calve in a blind or not. During the daytime, when there's a lot more people around and animal movement and machinery moving it around, more disruptions and more stress, they'll go and isolate. I really like to have a blind where you can have a gate that you can close. So if you have an animal that's calving in that blind, you can close the gate and again, then protect that animal from other cows coming in and disrupting it. Allow a space that you can more safely go and assist if necessary. Bedding in these areas that we talked about briefly needs to be deep, just deep bedding. But the type of bedding, if you look at the recommendations, they'll talk about what's best for the cow, but you also have to think about what's best for the calf in these. So deep bedding is preferred by far, especially over like rubber mats or concrete. Using shavings increases risk of metritis for cows. So we try and minimize shaving use in maternity areas. Sawdust and hulls, like soy hulls or almond hulls, really are too light to be used for calves because a calf's first breath after birth has about 10 times the force of a normal birth, and their face is usually right down in the bedding. And so there's a lot of research that shows that if the bedding is light, like sawdust or hulls, they'll inhale quite a bit and it just plasters in their lungs and really compromises their lung function permanently after that. So just easy to avoid that. Shredded newspaper, I don't see that as much anymore. That was popular for a little while. That'll form like paper mache on newborn calves. It just adheres tightly to them and then dries on like a rock. Sand doesn't really have the insulative properties to work well in cold weather. And when it gets wet, like with a calving cow and all the fluids that they're putting out at the time of calving, it freezes and hardens and develops sharp edges. And then it's not good for cows or calves at that point. So long stem straw, chopped corn stalks are really the best for that calving pen at that point. And that's the ideal bedding option. The big thing is keeping them clean. Again, I would say that it's a challenging investment for a lot of people. They'll say, "Well, straw is really expensive, and it's hard for me to justify keeping that pen deep bedded to where cows stay perfectly dry and clean," as in that left-hand picture. But the losses associated with calves that are born, like in the right-hand picture, are really high because if they don't die at birth, they're not only dying at some point in the next month, but they're costing you a lot of money in treatments and time. So straw is really relatively cheap compared to the cost of taking care of sick and dying calves. So I want to talk really quickly about managing the calving process. We're going to make this pretty quick and dirty. So just remember the stages of labor. The first stage is just when the cow is moving that calf up into position in the abdomen. They're restless, they increase position, the ligaments are loosening. And the second stage of labor is when that calf first starts to appear or the amniotic sac is observed, and you're getting abdominal contractions and active labor. And it ends when the calf is expelled. So through those stages are where we want the least amount of stress on that animal. Actually, on through the third stage, was just as expelling the placenta. We want as little stress as possible so that those things all happen rapidly and normally and without assistance. And so really our goal through all of those stages is to disrupt that animal as little as possible and just let that process occur as normally as possible. So recommendations through this is, again, allow the time for the cow to adapt to the calving environment before they start into labor. Thoroughly clean the perineal region of the cow because 90% of calves will be born with some type of bacterial infection if that perineal region is dirty or it's not cleaned. And it's a pretty easy, it's an easier thing to do with cows than heifers again, but as just trying to do what you can to keep that region clean. And then observing calvings and check position early. Again, this is easier to do with cows that are used to being handled and used to having people behind them. A lot of times you can walk up to cows in labor and they'll lay perfectly still on the ground while you check inside, check the calf, make sure that you've got 2 feet in the head. Pretty rare for calves to lay still while you're checking for those things. So that makes it much harder with heifers. So for a lot of operations, cameras make sense in a maternity barn. It's a good place to do that because it allows you to observe heifers in labor without having to actually go in the pen and disrupt them and increase their stress levels. Cameras are a lot cheaper now, so you can install multiple cameras in a maternity operation that swivel around and allow you to zoom in and really see what's happening. It's a bonus for the workers and management because you can do that from an office, you can do that from in your house at night, and not have to go out and do anything unless assistance is needed at some time. But it's especially a bonus for the heifers because you're not coming into that pen, whether it's a group pen or an individual pen, you're not coming anywhere around them while they're in the process of labor unless you absolutely have to. And so then you should only approach that animal or assist only when there's signs of maternal or fetal distress. And it's going to be mostly fetal distress that you need to worry about. This is where we do a pretty poor job in the industry is knowing when to assist. We like to jump in and assist if we haven't seen progress in a certain period of time, and that's not the ideal way to do this. So, and a lot of recommendations will say if you see large hooves coming out, that means a large calf, and that you should jump in and assist earlier and harder, which is absolutely the worst way to approach that. So larger calves take longer for that cervix to dilate. That's really the limiting factor in a calf being born is cervical dilation. And that takes longer for heifers and it takes longer for big calves. So if you've got a heifer with a big calf, you got to be really patient and let her work at it for a while, let that cervix dilate as long as that calf isn't in distress. And if you're patient and allow that to happen and stay out of the way, the cervix really has an incredible potential to dilate and allow a large calf out with any assistance. Good example of this, the ideal calf weight for survival. Dairy calves are born anywhere between 4.5% and 12% of the maternal body weight at calving. 7.5% is optimal for survival. Smaller calves are at much higher risk of dying, as are larger calves. But the larger calf death rate is greatly exacerbated by our over aggressive assistance. So when we first started doing work on this and allowing cows to just take as much time as they needed to calve, we had a heifer that was in labor for probably 6 hours. Took her a long time, but the calf was never in trouble and ended up being born unassisted. It was about 11% of that calf's weight. So it was a 126-pound calf out of 1,150-pound heifer, and there was no assistance at all provided for that animal. So patients will, in most cases, win the day unless there's an issue that's physiological, and those are pretty rare. So what are the signs of distress where you need to assist? Um, the the calf tongue is a really good indicator, and the good thing is that calves generally have their tongue hanging out while they're born. So if the tongue gets really pale or really dark blue or really long and floppy, those all indicate severe distress. Appearance of meconium or blood in the amniotic fluid is a sign of distress, and in those cases, you need to step in and assist. And in all other cases, we've just never assisted at all. So this would be a calf in distress. This is like worst possible thing. Got a long, dark purple, floppy tongue. Typically, the tongue is out from the mouth only less than half an inch. So you can see it's pretty obvious. It's not a subtle change when they get in distress. They just lose all muscle tone and that tongue will drop out a matter of inches. The placental pieces on the foreleg of that calf and all the blood in the amniotic fluid um, tell you that this is the calf that really needs some help at this point. When we do assist, we need to pull properly, double half hitching the chains onto the foreleg and are really reduce the amount of stress that's put on those forelegs and the amount of force that we put on. So typically it's one person pulling because a typical person can pull between 100 and 150 pounds of force. And you really don't want to exceed that 150 pounds of force. The uterus is pushing out with about 75 to 100 pounds of force. If you put another 150 pounds of force that you're pulling with, that's perfect. About 600 pounds of force will fracture the strongest bone on a calf, which is the femur, and a calf jack can generate between 1,500 and 2,000 pounds of force. So we have to really be careful when we're using calf jacks because we almost always are breaking ribs and often breaking the forelegs as well. We'll put spiral fractures in those forelegs if we pull hard on those. And then the last thing would be to stop assistance after last rib. So these are important things for cows and calves, but especially for heifers to not put too much force because you can do a lot of damage to the cow and the calf. After birth, we just want to make sure that the animal's breathing. I just wanted to throw this in because I still see a lot of people hanging calves upside down if they're not breathing to try and drain out the fluid from the lungs, which it does not do that. It just makes it harder for them to take that first breath because you're compressing the digestive organs against the diaphragm and making it harder to do that gasp. So you just want to stimulate a gasp. Cold water can do that, or stimulating the nostril. You see people use a piece of straw to do that. Cold water in the face will work as well. Rubbing the animal's chest stimulates the vagal nerve, and that will stimulate them to gasp sometimes as well. The last thing that's super stressful for heifers is getting that first milking colostrum out of that. Anyone that's ever milked a heifer for the first time knows how challenging that can be and how stressful that is on the heifer. Um, a lot of places now will habituate heifers to the milking parlor. So just running heifers through the milking parlor for a few times before it's their first time to get milked and having them get used to having, you don't put the machine on them, but having them get used to having that machine come up between their legs and having you touch their udder. So moving them in and out a few times until they get to where it's not as stressful for them to do that, and then move them back into a group pen. If you can move in small groups of heifers into your lactating cow group at a time and get them used to that, that makes that first milking experience greatly less stressful. And that has long-term impacts on milk production for those heifers. So it's worth it if you can build it into your strategy. It's a challenging thing for a lot of people I know, but Where it's possible, that's really increases production and profitability for those heifers. Milking those heifers in the calving pen um, usually is a more stressful kind of restraint for them than working through a parlor. And you add that with the novelty of the milking experience. Um, Animals milked in the calving pens are almost always show more stress response than those going through a parlor. If you're going to milk in a calving pen or in the maternity barn, consider installing a vacuum pump in a separate room to reduce that noise, because those portable vacuum pumps that you pull up to a calving pen are really loud, and that increases, again, the stress for those heifers going through that process. So again, it's all about thinking about that these heifers are submissive, and so trying to reduce the stress associated with moving in with older animals, and that they're undergoing a lot of novel experiences and trying to reduce the novelty of those experiences and the stress associated with those novel experiences. So final thoughts on this. Um, Making this a priority on a farm makes economic sense. You can decrease the losses and increase the production of these animals by focusing more on them at this point. Training farm personnel really needs to be with hands-on type demonstrations, group discussions and workshops to make sure that they really understand the concepts, but also can apply them when needed. So all of the things around handling the animals, make sure that people are handling the animals correctly and calmly. Um, because one person's idea of calm and slow and easy is greatly different than other people's. Make sure that they understand how and when to assist, and how easy it is to do, or how much disrupting calving can impact that calving process. So thinking about and strategizing for strategies that will either reduce the number of novel experiences, new groups, new facilities, new experiences like the calving and milking and new feeds, and to try and introduce heifers to those experiences and feeds before the transition periods will enhance short and long-term productivity through reduced dystocia, less stillbirths, more milk production, more reproductive performance, and ultimately more money in someone's pocket. So hopefully there's been a few thoughts that you can take from this and implement into the operations that you are working on or working with or own. And if there's any questions, I'd be happy to address those now.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Tyler. And like you said, if there's any questions, you can go ahead and put those into the chat, or we're a fairly small group. If you have a question, you can unmute as well. I did put the link for the evaluation into the chat already. So before you log off here today, if you wouldn't mind clicking on that and filling that out before you take off here today. Fred put into the chat, do crossbred calves behave differently?
Oh, good question. Yes, but I can't tell you. They are more resistant to stress in general. Um, they're less likely to be stillborn. They're less likely to die before calving. Um, I can't give you really good data other than that. There's differences between breeds. Jerseys will be different than brown Swiss, different than Ayrshires. So if you've been around brown Swiss heifers and Ayrshire heifers in the same group, like we used to have at Iowa State, Ayrshire heifers will kill you if you look at them wrong, and brown Swiss heifers take 10 minutes to know you're there. I think sometimes they're a lot calmer, and so temperament differs between breeds, and so I know temperament of crossbreds also differs from the purebreds that they're derived from. So, but I haven't seen really good data on that. That's a really good question, Fred. Do you have experience with that?
I
You
have
know,
seen some differences on the beef cross calves. Uh, I liked your comment about the Swiss heifers versus the Ayrshire heifers. I think you don't appreciate that unless you've been in a pen with them.
Dr. Tyler, there's a question in the chat. What should be average birth weight in heifers and adult calvers? And what should be calving ease?
So the average birth weight for heifers and adult and mature cows,
Hmm.
the average birth weight for Holstein, for calves coming from Holstein mature cows, well, from all Holsteins is like 91 pounds. Um, but for mature cows, it's a little over 100, and for heifers, it's down closer to 80. And that's average birth weight. And obviously, there's a pretty big range in the birth weights that are associated with that. Um, Optimal birth weight for calves born from heifers, there's been a little bit of research on that, like which ones grow up to be the most productive animals and have the most longevity, give the most milk, and it was closer to 70 pounds. So actually, lighter weight calves, we always kind of celebrate those 110-pound calves. But the most profitable animals tend to be smaller and more moderately sized at birth and maturity.
And there was a question about calving ease. I don't know if you want to
Oh,
comment on
yep.
that.
Um, I'd say if you're really focused on it, you can reduce the incidence of animals that need assistance down to less than 5%. Um, it's hard to get there sometimes because, like I say, disruptions in calving but not that many animals need assistance, and a lot of animals get more assistance than needed. So I think there's an opportunity to make a big difference that the right now over 25% of animals get assisted. So there's a huge opportunity for making more money on operations just by reducing how much time we're spending helping animals that don't need help.
All right. And I had a question. So I know a lot of our heifers now are being raised socially, right? In the pre-weaning phase. Do you know any research on looking at how that affects them coming into social housing in that maternity pen later on in life?
Um, I have not seen good data on that. They do better socially when they're moved into group pens initially, but there hasn't been work on like how they do when they're reintroduced into adult cows. Um, from anecdotally, I'd say it doesn't make a big difference for that heifer that was raised with the same group of um, heifers all the way through birth in a group pen and stayed in social groups. If they're introduced individually into adult cows, they still end up being submissive and end up getting more aggressions heaped on them through that first period. So it's really stressful. Moving them as a social group through that period really reduces stress, but that's super challenging to do on a lot of operations to maintain and have a whole group of heifers stay together through all the way up into lactation pens and keep it. You have to have a pretty big operation to be able to keep your heifers in a separate pen from cows all the way through that first lactation.
And then I was really intrigued about the comments about there's more aggression from older cows if they're moved in the morning time. And I find a lot of our, I guess, at least farms that I've worked with, we try to get a lot of our stuff done in the morning, right? Moving cattle,
Yep.
getting all our stuff done right away so that we have the rest of the afternoon to catch up on everything else or go do field work. So how do we move our management mindset to something like that?
Yeah, that was new data for me too, and it was super clear data. the amount of aggression in the morning was not just slightly more, it was a lot. Cows are much more aggressive when they have heifers moved in with them in the morning, and maybe because there's all these other things going on too, and the heifers are already spooky and scary, and then they get dropped in this pen. So that the heifers are extra submissive and the cows are extra aggressive, and it's an ugly situation. But yeah, moving, I thought about that too, is like how do you shift that mindset, um, and the work patterns that go around that. And I think um, with anything where you're changing habits, it's a matter of making a commitment to do it for a while to see how it works first and be like, we're just going to commit extra resources in the evening to moving heifers and see if it really makes a difference for us. Um, and then when you see that, when you get that positive reinforcement that it is work, it's easier then to work out the strategies where you're not committing extra resources and you're just getting it done as a matter of course. And it just becomes part of the daily routine. I think anyone changing habits in a busy day is really challenging. Um, and you have to be able to prove to yourself that it's worth the time.
All right, Fred or Larry, you see any other questions?
Dr. Tyler, I'd like to follow up on Muhammad's uh, question about the calving ease. Do you see these calving ease scores that are included in every bull book? Are they subjective? I mean, can we rely on them, or are there, if I have to look at the cow having a calf, she's going to get a score versus my neighbor who has to get the 40/20 out before he puts a score down?
Yeah. Um, on any individual farm, they're almost worthless, except to tell you what's happening on that farm, but they don't really tell you whether or not it was needed. So there's a lot of cows or calvings that are scored a calving you score of 5, um, because the jack was put on. It's not it was needed, but it was given, right? Like there was, and sometimes the cow can be in labor all night and you never saw a thing, and she's almost dead and the calf's almost dead, and they really needed assistance and didn't get any, and that's a calving you score of 1. So, but across a large data set like there's used in the bull studs, I think there are some good trends that pop out of those where um, some of those that you should not be, some of those bulls that you should not be breeding your heifers to pop out, that tend to throw calves that are 125 pounds. So even though we didn't assist that one heifer that had the 126-pound calf, I wouldn't necessarily want to breed her back to the same bull because that was a long drawn out thing, but the calf was born vigorous and jumped up right away. It was a bit of a shock when we weighed it out, and we're like, because this was early on when we were first doing this research, and I had a lot of panicked people in the barn, and they're like, that heifer's still in labor, and she's been in labor for more than 30 minutes. We need to get a jack out and get that calf out. And like, nope, the calf's not in distress. We're not touching it. And they're like, it's gonna die. I had people almost in tears. So because it was so, uh, our approach was so opposite to what they had always done. Um, the policy on a lot of places and the policy on our farm back then was if you didn't see progress in 30 minutes, then you went in and put on the jack and got the calf out. Um, and a lot of times for a heifer, when you move a heifer into a pen, 30 minutes, she's barely starting to calm down. And then you go and throw a jack on her, you're getting no help from that heifer in that process. There's been no dilation. So we're pulling the 125-pound calf out of a 60-pound hole, and it's going to be damaging to the heifer and damaging to the calf. So that to me that's another one of those mindset changes, like we were just talking about with when to move cows, is you have to get people to commit to it to a little while. And then when they've done it for a while, they're like, wow, okay, that really does work. And we don't have to assist all the time. And I talk to people that are like, "Hey, we put our jack away 3 years ago, and we used to use it weekly, and we haven't touched it in a couple of years now." So it's habits that you build, and seeing things that are things from a different paradigm and in a different way than you've been taught to see it in the past. It's hard to unlearn what you've been taught. Um,
That's for sure. Howard, just a question. When you mentioned like with the calving ease, so we had a client one time that I think they had about 60 heifers and they ended up C-sectioning about 12 to 15 out of a. They all came out of the same bull. So at what point do you start looking at towards C-section and what kind of research might there be out there just on the impact of that cow or the calf when you start having to C-section it?
yeah, it's funny because I've asked a lot of veterinarians that because I'm not real clear on when their decision to C-section is versus not. Um, and I've gotten different answers from everyone I've asked. So I'm not sure that there's really good recommendations on that. I have not seen good recommendations. I'll say that there
Okay.
probably is out there. I just haven't seen it. Um, I have in 35 years of delivering calves and doing newborn calf research and being on operations where we delivered 150 calves a day, um, only ever had to do one C-section in 34 years. So, and I'm not sure we had to do that one. It was just, that was really early for me and I didn't know what to do. And we called in the vet to make sure we didn't do anything wrong. And he was like, "Oh, we're going to just have to cut this one out." And I don't know if it needed it or it was just more from his practice. So I don't have a good answer for you on that, Larry. I wish I did.
Yeah, I think
Um,
on this farm they just the first couple that they couldn't get out very easy at all, even with a little patience, they started realizing that they're just kind of just kind of prepping themselves that these are probably going to be C-section ones because, like I said, they all came from the same sire,
yeah, yep.
and they're all is a group of heifers.
I worked with an operation that was it was a commercial enterprise. It was run by a group of veterinarians, and they were doing C-sections on like 50% of their animals, and jacking out every one like that. And that was their policy because they said we care about the health of the calf more than the cow, so we jack everything out, and if we can't get it jacked out in 10 minutes, then we C-section. And I was like, holy cow. Because C-section does have detrimental effects on the subsequent performance of those animals. They don't uh, they struggle with lung function, and that means they struggle with energy production, and so they don't grow as well. They don't milk as much. They C-section calves tend to not perform very well. So, and jacked calves obviously don't perform very well, but it's again getting into that mindset. It's kind of a self-fulfilling thing if you see big hooves on a calf and you go to jack it out and you jack it out and break 3 ribs and do a lot of damage and the calf drops out and it's barely alive. You're like, well, we got to get in earlier next time. And I've seen a lot of places do that with really well-intentioned and really smart people and well-educated. And gosh, yeah, worked with a place where they were jacking out fully 50%. They had 25% stillbirths. They were jacking everything they saw. And they were literally going in and reaching through the cervix to put chains on animals to jack them out because they said, we're really struggling with getting live calves out. So we're going in as early as possible. And they killed 3 cows by, by jacking out calves so early and so hard. But it was their mindset was that they needed to even do more and get in earlier, and it was really hard to break that what they saw as happening, break that habit, and say instead of going in as early as possible and throwing chains on, what I want you to do is nothing. Just stand and watch for a while, and unless you see these signs, don't touch them. And it was super hard for them to make that transition and move to that. We got there. We went from 26% stillbirths to 1% on that operation within 3 months. So it was not the bulls that were being used. It was strictly the aggressiveness that they were approaching calving with.
Too bad.
Lots of
No
good
more questions
discussion
here,
and
sir.
question.
Yeah.
I think there's one last question in here we'll take, and then we'll wrap up here. But there's a question about what is the calf livability rate, or what's a normal calf livability rate?
Yeah, so, well, normal, I guess, typical. So what we have nationally, we lose about 20% of all calves in this country. So in the dairy industry are including stillbirths. So a lot of times you'll see it at about 10%, 11%, but that doesn't include stillbirths. I don't know why they don't include stillbirths, and that is in calf mortality. But so calf livability is not good. But again, some of the places I work with have 1.5% losses all the way through from birth to weaning, and up through calving, they'll keep it under 5%. So if you can get more than 95% of your calves that are born to live through calving, it gives you a lot more opportunity to cull cows and to make management decisions that can improve profitability. People that are losing 20% of their calves don't have a lot left in terms of making decisions on culling. And so you're only culling for reproductive failure. Like you're only able to cull cow. You can't cull cows for money. You're just culling cows because they're no longer livable on your farm.
All right, thanks
That
for
really addressed the question,
yeah.
but that's how I think about things. The number one thing I think in terms of profitability on farms is being able to make culling decisions based on profitability of cows and not just reproductive failure, hoof issues, mastitis issues that we normally do. The only cows that leave our farms leave because of issues or dying on most operations, and not because we're making issues based on the profitability of that animal.
All right, looks like he answered his question. He says thanks. So appreciate you putting those questions into the chat, and want to thank everybody for being online here today. And we'll be back next Wednesday talking about raising heifers on pasture with Larry Trannell, who's actually on our call here today. So I'll hope to have you back here at noon, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.